I just discovered my mother lied about my real father for 35 years, and now she's threatening to expose my husband's affair if I don't stay silent about her dirty secret. I'm still trying to wrap my head around the bombshell that just dropped. My name is Sarah, 35F, and up until a few weeks ago, I thought I knew who I was, where I came from, and what my life was built on. But everything I thought I knew has come crashing down in the most twisted, sickening way imaginable. It started innocently enough. My mother, Jane, 58F, had been acting strange for the last few months, more secretive, distant, even paranoid. At first I chalked it up to her age, maybe something to do with her health or the stress of life creeping up on her. But the more she avoided me, the more suspicious I became. She'd cut our phone calls short, cancel plans last minute, and whenever I mentioned my dad, Michael 60M, who passed away 5 years ago, her face would darken like I'd struck a nerve. I've always had a strong relationship with my mom. We've been close since I was a little girl, and we leaned on each other even more after my dad died. So this change in her behavior rattled me to the core. It was like she was hiding something big. And boy, was I right. 2 weeks ago, I decided to clean out my mom's attic while she was out of town visiting my aunt. She had been talking about getting rid of old junk for years, but never got around to it. I figured I'd do her a favor. What I found instead destroyed everything. In an old box shoved into the corner, I came across some letters between my mom and a man named Richard. I didn't recognize the name, and at first I assumed it was an old friend or a relative I didn't know about. But as I started reading the letters, my heart stopped. The letters were intimate, detailed, and dated from before I was born. Richard wasn't just some random friend. He was my mother's lover, and based on the timing, it became clear that he wasn't just her lover. He was my real father. I sat there on the dusty attic floor, reading page after page, learning that my entire life had been a lie. My mom had been having an affair with Richard for years before I was born, right around the time she got pregnant with me. And apparently my dad, the man who had raised me, loved me, and who I had mourned for years, had no idea. He died thinking I was his biological daughter. I can't describe the wave of emotions that crashed over me. Anger, betrayal, confusion, grief. How could she keep something like this from me for 35 years? How could she let me go through my entire life not knowing who my real father was? I was crushed. I felt like I didn't know who I was anymore. I needed answers, so I confronted my mom the moment she returned from her trip. I brought up the letters and demanded to know the truth. At first she tried to deny it, but when she saw the stack of old love letters in my hands, she knew the game was up. She sat me down, and after what felt like an eternity of awkward silence, she confessed. Yes, Richard was my real father. Yes, she had lied to me, to my dad, to everyone. Her justification? I did what I had to do to protect our family. Your father never would have accepted the truth. It would have destroyed him. Her words hit me like a punch in the gut. Protect the family? Destroy him? What about me? What about my life built on lies? I was furious, heartbroken, and I let her know it. The betrayal ran so deep I couldn't even look her in the eye. I was about to storm out when she dropped another bombshell that took this whole twisted mess to a level I hadn't expected. She stood up, blocking my way to the door, and said, Sarah, before you go running your mouth, you need to understand something. If you try to ruin me, I will ruin you too. You think I don't know about Eric? Eric, my husband. I froze. What was she talking about? Eric, 37M, and I had been married for 7 years. Sure, we had our ups and downs, like any couple, but as far as I knew, everything was fine. But the look in her eyes told me that she knew something I didn't. I know all about Eric's little affair, she said coldly, and if you breathe a word about Richard, I will make sure everyone knows. Your friends, your family, your work, everyone. I'll expose him for the cheating scumbag he is. I felt the blood drain from my face. My husband, an affair? What the hell was she talking about? But she continued, relentless in her attack. Do you really want your marriage dragged through the mud, Sarah? Do you want to be the woman everyone pities because her husband couldn't keep it in his pants? I was stunned. I had no idea what she was talking about, but the conviction in her voice, the cold smirk on her face, it terrified me. Could she be right? Could Eric really be cheating on me? And even if he wasn't, she could make it look like he was. My mother had the power to destroy my marriage, my reputation, everything. And she wasn't afraid to use it to protect her dirty little secret. I left her house that day without saying another word. I was in shock, my head spinning with too many questions, too much betrayal to process all at once. My entire world had been turned upside down, and the person I thought I could trust the most had become my worst enemy. The worst part was, I had no idea what to believe anymore. Was my mom really capable of ruining my life like that? Was Eric actually cheating on me? I had to find out, and that's where the real nightmare began. After my mother's threats, I couldn't just let things sit. I had to find out the truth for myself about both her and my husband. The weight of her betrayal was enough to crush me, but now the idea that Eric might have been unfaithful after all these years made everything so much worse. When I got home, Eric greeted me as if nothing had changed. He smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and asked how my day was, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire world had just been shattered. I couldn't confront him right then. I couldn't just throw it all at him without any proof. If he wasn't cheating, I'd destroy our marriage for nothing. But if he was, I needed to know before he could spin some story to cover his tracks. The next few days were hell. I watched him like a hawk, looking for anything, any little slip-up that would confirm what my mother had said. He acted completely normal, which in some ways made it worse. How could someone hide something like that so well? Was he really capable of living a double life without me noticing? I started going through his phone, checking his messages when he wasn't around. I knew it was an invasion of his privacy, but after what my mother had told me, I had no choice. At first, everything seemed clean. No suspicious texts, no strange calls, no clues. But then I dug deeper into his email, into his old messages, and that's when I found it. Buried deep in his inbox was a series of emails to someone named Mia. They weren't explicit, but they were familiar, too familiar. She asked about his day, about how work was going, about their next meetup. My heart pounded as I scrolled through the exchange, each message making it more and more obvious what was going on. Eric had been seeing this woman for months. They'd had lunch, drinks, maybe more. I wasn't sure yet, but I was terrified to keep looking. There were even hints in the emails that Mia knew about me. She asked, "Did you tell her yet? And how are things at home? Does she suspect anything?" It felt like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe it. My husband, the man I thought I knew better than anyone, had been lying to me. My mother was right. Eric was cheating, and he had been for a while. The more I read, the more my world crumbled beneath me. I wanted to throw up, to scream, to confront him right then and there. But I held back. I needed to know everything before I made my move. I needed to see the full picture before I blew up our lives. That night, I lay in bed next to him, wide awake, my mind racing. Eric snored softly beside me, completely unaware of the storm brewing in my head. I stared at the ceiling, the darkness closing in around me. My mother had dropped this bombshell knowing exactly what it would do. She had played me perfectly, and now she had me trapped. If I exposed her secret about my real father, she'd ruin me by exposing Eric. But what choice did I have? I couldn't let her get away with what she'd done. The next morning, I woke up with a plan. I had to meet this Mia. I needed to see her face, confront her, and get her side of the story. Maybe she didn't know he was married. Maybe she was just as much of a victim as I was. Or maybe she was the villain in this whole thing, knowingly helping him destroy our marriage. Either way, I had to know. I started by tracking her down online. It wasn't hard. Eric had been careless with her email address, and a quick search brought up her social media profiles. She was pretty, younger than me by a few years, with a perfect life plastered all over her Instagram. It made me sick. How could he betray me for someone like her? What did she have that I didn't? But it wasn't until I dug deeper into her posts that I found the real kicker. She wasn't just some random fling, she was married. Married with kids, just like me. She had a husband, a family, a whole life that she was risking for Eric. And worse, her posts hinted at meetings, secret getaways, and times when she was clearly lying to her own husband. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This woman had the same stakes as I did, the same risks, yet she was willing to throw it all away for my husband. My hands shook as I scrolled through her pictures, my mind buzzing with questions. Did her husband know? Was he just as oblivious as I had been? And if I confronted her, what would happen next? I had to be smart about this. I couldn't just show up at her doorstep and start yelling. So I sent her a message, something simple. "We need to talk about Eric." Her response came quickly, just one word. "Who is this?" I didn't answer. I wanted her to squirm. I wanted her to wonder. Later that night, Eric left for what he said was a late meeting with a client. But I knew better now. I tracked his phone, something I never thought I'd do but was now essential to survive this nightmare. Sure enough, His location led him to a hotel on the outskirts of town. I knew exactly where he was headed. I followed him. I drove there with my heart pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I parked down the street, close enough to see but far enough to stay hidden. My pulse was racing, my mind spinning with what I was about to do. When I saw Eric walk out of the car and head inside, my worst fears were confirmed. I watched him disappear through the hotel doors. I wanted to run in, scream, demand answers. But instead, I sat in my car, tears streaming down my face as I tried to decide what to do next. I couldn't go in there. I couldn't make a scene. I needed to be smarter than that. So I waited, my mind buzzing with anger, fear, and betrayal as the night unfolded before me. The next morning, my mind was still racing from everything I had witnessed the night before. I had seen Eric go into that hotel, and though I didn't follow him inside, I didn't need to. I knew exactly what he was doing in there, and I knew who he was with. But instead of storming in, I sat in my car, paralyzed, replaying every moment in my head. How long had this been going on? How many lies had he told me? All while I lay beside him every night, oblivious to the double life he was leading? I needed answers, and I was done waiting around. It was time to confront Eric head-on. No more sneaking around, no more games. I needed to see the truth in his eyes. When Eric came home later that day, I was sitting at the kitchen table waiting for him. He looked surprised to see me there, but he didn't say anything at first. I could tell something was off. He was more cautious than usual, like he was tiptoeing around me. I didn't bother with small talk. I went straight for the jugular. "Where were you last night, Eric?" He froze. For a moment, he looked like a deer caught in headlights, but then his expression shifted. "What do you mean? I told you I had a meeting." "With who?" I pressed, not backing down. My voice was calm, but my hands were trembling under the table. "Just a client. It was late, so we decided to meet somewhere more convenient." He was lying, and I knew it. His voice wavered just enough for me to hear the cracks in his story. I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're lying to me, Eric. I know about the hotel. I know about Mia." For a split second, his face went pale, but then he quickly recovered, putting on a facade of indignation. "What the hell are you talking about? Are you spying on me now? Have you lost your mind?" I stood up, my anger boiling over. "Don't you dare turn this around on me. I followed you to that hotel, Eric. I saw you go in. I know you've been meeting with her. I've seen the emails, the messages. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me?" His face twisted into a mixture of anger and fear. "You had no right to go through my things," he snapped. "That's a complete invasion of privacy." "Invasion of privacy? You've been having an affair behind my back for months, maybe longer. How could you do this to me, to us?" For a moment, he didn't respond. He just stood there staring at me as if he were trying to come up with the right words. And then, without warning, he shifted into a different tactic, one I hadn't expected. His expression softened, and he let out a long, tired sigh. "Look," he said, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't plan for this to happen. Mia, it just sort of happened. Things between us were strained, and I needed someone to talk to." "Talk?" I scoffed, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what you call sneaking off to hotels with her? Talking?" "It wasn't like that," he insisted, but his eyes told a different story. "I mean, yes, we crossed a line, but it wasn't what you think. Don't lie to me anymore, Eric. I know what you've been doing. You're not going to talk your way out of this one." At that moment, all the anger, all the frustration, and the pain I had been bottling up exploded. I didn't care about keeping calm anymore. I didn't care about being rational. I was done. "How long has this been going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "How long have you been sneaking around behind my back?" Eric hesitated, but then, finally, he muttered, "A few months." "It started a few months ago." "A few months?" My heart sank. All this time, while I thought we were working on our marriage, while I thought we were getting better, he had been with her. All those nights he came home late, all those business trips. It was all a lie. My whole marriage had been a lie. "And Mia?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Does her husband know? Does he know what you two have been doing?" Eric looked down at the floor, avoiding my gaze. "I don't know," he admitted. We haven't talked about it." I shook my head, my mind spinning. This was worse than I had imagined. Not only had Eric betrayed me, but Mia had betrayed her own family too, and now they were dragging me down with them. But there was one more thing I needed to know. the thing that had been haunting me since my conversation with my mother. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Eric," I said slowly, "my mother told me something about you and her." His eyes widened in surprise, and I knew I had hit a nerve. "She said you had an affair with her too. Is that true?" Eric's face went pale. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, frozen, as if he were deciding how much to admit. And then, finally, he spoke. "It was a long time ago," he said quietly, "before we were married. It was a mistake." A mistake, that's what he called it. My entire world had been ripped apart, and all he could say was that it was a mistake. I felt like I couldn't breathe. "You slept with my mother?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, guilt written all over his face. "It was before we got serious, I swear. I didn't know." "You didn't know what?" I interrupted, my voice rising again. "That you were sleeping with the woman who gave birth to me. That you were betraying both of us in the worst possible way." Eric didn't answer. He just stood there, looking at me with those same guilty eyes, and I realized that everything had been a lie. My mother had been using me, manipulating me, and Eric had been helping her. They had been in on it together from the start, and now here I was, caught in the middle of their twisted web of lies. The days following my confrontation with my mother felt like a whirlwind. It was as if every part of my life was unraveling all at once, each thread tugging at something more sinister beneath the surface. My marriage was over, my relationship with my mother was severed, and I knew I was about to face a battle that could destroy what little was left of my reputation. But I wasn't backing down, not this time. The first thing I did was hire a lawyer. I knew that if I wanted to protect myself from both Eric and my mother's manipulative schemes, I had to prepare for the worst. My lawyer, a tough-as-nails woman named Carla, listened intently as I explained everything. Eric's affair, my mother's involvement, and her threats to expose Eric's infidelity if I didn't stay quiet about her lies. "This is a mess," Carla said bluntly, tapping her pen against her notepad. "But we can fight it. If your mother has been blackmailing you and trying to cover up the truth, we can use that. We'll need to gather evidence, though. Do you have anything concrete?" I nodded, feeling a small sense of relief that I wasn't in this alone anymore. I've been keeping all the messages from both Eric and my mother. I also have some old emails from when my mother was trying to manipulate me into staying in my marriage. "Good," Carla said with a nod. "That's a start. We'll also need to prepare for any fallout if your mother goes public with Eric's affair. It could get ugly, but we can make sure you're not left holding the blame." The rest of the meeting was a blur of legal jargon and strategies, but by the end, I felt more prepared than I had in weeks. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was planning, strategizing, and it felt empowering. But as much as I wanted to move forward, the weight of everything still hung over me like a dark cloud. My mother's threat wasn't an empty one, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she tried to make good on it. I didn't have to wait long. A few days after my meeting with Carla, I received an anonymous email. It was from someone claiming to be a reporter, asking for a statement on the rumors about Eric's affair. My heart sank as I read the message. This was it. My mother had leaked the information, just as she had threatened. I forwarded the email to Carla immediately, and she called me within minutes. "We expected this," she said calmly. "Don't panic. We can still control the narrative. I'll reach out to the reporter and set up a formal response. The key is to stay ahead of it and make sure they don't twist the story against you." But staying calm was easier said than done. My entire life was being dragged into the spotlight, and I knew that once the media got involved, there would be no way to keep any of it private. It felt like my mother had ripped away the last vestige of control I had over my life, leaving me exposed and vulnerable. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and meetings with Carla. She was a force to be reckoned with, refusing to let the media spin the story in favor of my mother's narrative. She carefully crafted a statement that put the focus on Eric's betrayal and my mother's manipulation, leaving little room for anyone to paint me as the villain. But even with Carla's help, the damage was done. The story spread like wildfire, and soon enough, everyone in our town knew about Eric's affair. Friends who I thought I could trust began to distance themselves, unsure of what to believe. It felt like I was being slowly isolated, bit by bit, as my mother's lies poisoned every relationship I had left. And yet, through it all, I refused to break. I confronted Eric one last time. It wasn't planned, but I couldn't stand the thought of him walking away from everything he'd done without facing the consequences. I went to the house, our house, though it no longer felt like mine, and found him packing his things. I see you're still running, I said, my voice cold as ice. Eric didn't look up at first, but when he did, there was a flash of guilt in his eyes. I'm not running. I'm leaving because it's what you wanted. Don't turn this around on me, I snapped. You've been lying to me for years, Eric. You've been lying to everyone, and now you're hiding behind my mother like some coward, letting her do your dirty work. He flinched at that, but he didn't deny it. What do you want me to say? I screwed up. I've made mistakes. Mistakes? I cut him off, my voice rising. This wasn't a mistake, Eric. This was a calculated betrayal. You and my mother, you both knew exactly what you were doing, and now you're trying to destroy me because you don't want to face the consequences. He didn't respond. He just stood there, looking defeated, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the years of lies, the way he had torn apart our marriage, the way he had let my mother manipulate me for her own selfish reasons. I don't care what happens to you, I said finally. I don't care what happens to either of you, but I'm done playing your game. I'm going to expose everything, the affair, the lies, all of it. Eric's eyes widened in panic. You can't. I can, I interrupted. And I will. You can both try to ruin my life all you want, but I'm not going down without a fight. I turned and walked out of the house without another word, feeling a sense of finality wash over me. It was over. My marriage, my relationship with my mother, it was all over. But for the first time in a long time, I felt free. The next few weeks were a blur of legal proceedings, media coverage, and painful conversations with friends and family. But through it all, I held my ground. My mother and Eric tried to spin their lies, tried to paint me as the villain, but I refused to let them win. With Carla by my side, I fought back, exposing the truth about their betrayal and their manipulations. It wasn't easy. It was messy, painful, and at times, I wondered if it was worth it. But in the end, I knew that I couldn't live a lie any longer. I couldn't let them control me, couldn't let them dictate the narrative of my life. In the end, I lost a lot. My marriage, my relationship with my mother, and many of my so-called friends were gone. But I gained something far more valuable, my freedom. And that was worth every sacrifice.